All right, guys, in this video, I want to talk a little bit about Freud's psychosexual stages. Now, Freud is one of the first researchers that explains that what happens to us in childhood follows us forever into adulthood. And specifically, Freud focuses on what he calls psychosexual stages. Psycho here refers to your mind and specifically kind of how your personality will develop. And sexual here refers to feelings of pleasure. And what Freud says is that throughout different stages in our childhood, we have different erogenous zones. That is, different parts of our body which create pleasure for us. And depending on how we deal with that erogenous zone during that specific stage, it will alter our personality ever so slightly in adulthood. Now, the first stage occurs from birth to around 1 year old, and Freud calls this the oral stage because the erogenous zone here is the mouth. The baby gets pleasure by putting things in its mouth, specifically food, because babies usually breastfeed or bottle feed. Then we're talking about a bottle or the breast. Now, if everything goes perfectly during this stage, the baby doesn't feel any anxiety, mom always feeds the baby on time or dad feeds the baby on time, and the baby doesn't really develop a lot of anxiety around their mouth, around their erogenous zone in stage one, then they just move on. Then nothing happens. They just move on to the next stage. But if they do develop an anxiety because mom and dad don't feed the baby at the right times, or they take away food, or they deny food from the baby, then this baby will develop an anxiety. And this anxiety will follow the baby all throughout its adult life. Now, this can come out in a lot of different ways, but all of these ways are related to the mouth, right? So people become fixated, that is, kind of obsessed with doing things that have to do with the mouth. For example, they might smoke. They might really enjoy eating a lot of different foods. They might be kind of obsessed with kissing or oral hygiene. You might have a friend always has a pick in his mouth, just cleaning his mouth all the time. Now, for some people, they do a reaction formation, right? They will repress their desires to sort of focus on the mouth, and they will try to do the exact opposite. And this is your friend who's always dieting. Mind you, they're also always eating, but they're always talking about how they're dieting and they never lose any weight. This is your friend who's super shy, and whenever you talk to her, she puts her hands in front of her mouth and she just kind of mumbles at you, "Hey, where do you want to go?" "I wanna go." And she just kind of always kind of mumbling at you, and you're like, I don't know what you're saying, right? Again, this is a form of reaction formation. She has this desire to show her oral fixation, but she has repressed that desire and shown the exact opposite as she stops herself from trying to speak. Now, again, some people will sublimate. Remember, sublimation is sort of that good one, that good defense mechanism that pushes our energy into something that is socially acceptable. These individuals might be knowledge seekers, not so much because they love to learn, although they probably do, but more so because they love to talk about it. Freud would say that teachers are fixated in their oral stage because we just love to talk and talk and talk. Um, People who are humorous always have a joke, they always know the right thing to say. People who are witty, they always sort of have a comeback for something. This is a form of sublimation of their oral fixation. Freud would say that these individuals are fixated in their oral state. That is, they're adults, but they have sort of regress. Every once in a while, they regress into their oral stage. Now, regardless of whether you went through the oral stage perfectly or you became fixated, eventually you're going to get older and you're going to go through your anal stage. So this happens at around 1 to 3 years old. And now the erogenous zone is the anus. And more specifically, the child here is trying to learn how to potty train, how to control their bowels. And if mom and dad are really good at this and they cheer the baby on and they give him high fives when he does it just right, um, then this baby will finish potty training and will never look back. They'll never think about this stage again. But sometimes mom and dad are not good at making the baby feel successful. And so instead, they yell at the baby when he makes a mess. And sometimes they will use sort of the adult potty, and the flushing scares kids, and that can create anxieties as well. So if the child develops a lot of anxieties, they might again become fixated here. These people often have a notable interest in their bowels. This is your friend who's always talking about going to the bathroom. I took a dump yesterday and you should have seen it, blah, 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 right? They're always talking about poo or pee, and they almost can't control themselves. They sort of have bathroom humor, again, sort of gross humor related to excrement. We often call these people anal expulsive. And specifically, Freud suggests that when a child is 1 to 3 and mom and dad are yelling at the kid or making the kid feel bad, the way the kid controls his or her own life is not by saying, like, well, I need to learn how to control my bowels. What they do is the opposite. They go, oh, you want to get mad at me? Well, watch this. I'm really gonna make you mad at me. And they potty on themselves on purpose, or they might urinate in the corner. Kids do that sometimes. Um, and so Freud suggests that that person is much more likely to develop that anal expulsive personality. But some kids, either early on or later in life, realize that this is not okay. And so they create a reaction formation. They repress those feelings of messiness and um, anxiety about going to the bathroom, and they replace it with the exact opposite. These people become incredibly clean. They're stubborn. They like everything to sort of be perfect. They're kind of obsessive compulsive. Um, and Freud calls these individuals anal retentive. If you've ever called somebody anal, if you've ever said, you're so anal, what you were really calling them was anal retentive, which means this kid learned to hold in their bowels. They learned that it's better to just hold it in for as long as possible. So that way they only go to the bathroom the least amount of times. Um, and again, as they get older, this sort of develops into this sort of obsessive need to clean and be sort of perfect. Now, some people, of course, sublimate. They repress their feelings and they let out those energies in a socially acceptable way. And these people love to paint, not just like paint, but they tend to like the messiness of painting. They're going to enjoy finger painting a lot more. They're going to enjoy sort of making messes, or their artwork is going to look more messy. These people often like sculpting, specifically with clay, because there the clay is going to represent the poo. And these people are also overly giving. This is your friend who's like, oh, look, I bought you a present. Why? I just thought of you. This individual, unconsciously, right? Consciously, in their awareness, they just think you're great and they want to give you a present. But unconsciously, what's happening is that they're secretly giving you their poo. We sometimes say giving you their shit, right? That's literally part of the language because it is sort of part of the way we think about things. Now, just as before, whether you get fixated at the anal stage or not, if you went through it perfectly, you have to go to the next stage. And the next stage is the phallic stage. Now, before I go deeply into what the phallic stage is, I want to tell you two short little stories, and you might have heard them. which are the story of Oedipus and the story of Electra. Both of these are Greek myths. Now, the story of Oedipus starts when his father, the king of Thebes, was out doing Greek hero things, and he ended up at the oracle at Delphi. And the oracle at Delphi was a little girl who was in a cave, and you went in there with her, and she would start to prophesize your future according to the god Apollo. And what the oracle at Delphi told Laius, Oedipus's father, was that Oedipus would one day grow up and murder his own father and marry his own mother. And when Laius heard this, he was like, oh, this is crazy. We can't have this. And so there's a problem in Greek mythology is that you can't kill anybody who's related to you. If you do, the fates get angry with you and they make you go crazy. But there's a loophole. And the loophole is if you leave a baby outside in the wilderness and some animal eats it, then you're fine. You're clean. That you technically didn't kill your family member. And so that's what Laius does. He leaves the baby out in the wilderness, and a shepherd kind of sees the baby and feels bad for Oedipus. And just then, a couple is coming down the road in a chariot, and that couple happened to be the king and queen of Corinth. And so the shepherd gives the baby to the king and queen of Corinth, and Oedipus grows up a prince, and he thinks that these two people are his mom and dad. And he goes out doing Greek hero adventure things. And of course, one of the things that he ends up doing is he ends up at the oracle at Delphi, just like his biological father before him. And the oracle tells Oedipus that one day he will end up murdering his own father and marrying his own mother. Remember that Oedipus thinks that the queen and king of Corinth are his parents. So he vows to never go back to Corinth, and he keeps on doing Greek hero things. And one of the things that he does is he answers the Sphinx riddle, and the Sphinx kills herself. And because of that, he ends up getting to be the king of Thebes. The problem is that the king of Thebes is Laius, his biological father. And so things happen, and he ends up murdering the king of Thebes, his own father. And he ends up marrying the queen, Jocasta, who is his own mother. They have children together. Eventually, they find out, and Jocasta kills herself. Mom kills herself. And uh, Oedipus gouges out his own eyes. And that's the picture you're seeing there. Okay, that's a very lovely story. Let me tell you another one. The next one is the story of Electra. Now, not Electra from Marvel, but Electra from uh, Greek mythology. And so Electra was the daughter of Agamemnon. And you might remember Agamemnon from the Trojan War. He was one of the generals. And so he's in Troy, and they win, and they sack Troy. And when they sack Troy, they steal all the gold and all the servants. And one of the things that Agamemnon steals is a girl whose name is Cassandra. And Cassandra can see the future, but she's been cursed by the gods that no one will ever believe her. And so she tells Agamemnon, don't take me with you. If you take me with you, we're both going to die. And Agamemnon obviously doesn't believe her. He takes Cassandra back home, and his wife, Clytemnestra, kills them both. Now, when Electra finds out about this, she creates a plan to murder her mom. And depending on which story you're reading, it's her by herself or with her brother or with her brother and a cousin. They create a plan and they end up murdering Clytemnestra. Now, again, another lovely story. And you might be thinking to yourself, what does that have to do with anything? Well, Freud says that when boys enter their phallic stage, they go through what he calls the Oedipus complex. So, what happened? At around 3 years old, a baby boy falls desperately in love with his mother. Um, and there's a problem though. He realizes that dad also is in love with mom. And he creates a plan. And the plan is he's going to kill off dad so he can keep mom all to himself. However, the baby understands that dad is way too big. And if dad finds out that baby is in love with mom, dad might kill the baby or he might castrate the baby. He might cut off his genitals. Um, and so, what the baby decides is to buddy up to dad so that he can learn all that he can learn from dad. And eventually, the plan is that he's going to kill off dad as soon as he figures out how, and so he can keep mom all to himself. Now, as the baby gets closer to 5 years old, he starts to notice that this doesn't really make sense, right? He's sort of getting smarter. And so the baby goes, this doesn't make sense. This seems wrong. And now what the baby does is that they repress all of those feelings that they have for mom and all of the feelings that they've had to dad, and they push them down into their unconscious mind. And as they do that, they internalize all those things that they learned from dad. All those things get internalized as the baby's super ego. Now, it's Jung who comes around and talks about the Electra complex. So Jung is one of Freud's students. And so Jung talks about the Electra complex. It's very similar. The baby girl falls desperately in love with her father. And she realizes that mom is also in love with dad. She knows that she has to kill off mom so that she can keep dad to herself. But just like the boy, she's afraid that mom, if she figures this out, mom will kill her. And so what she does is she buddies up to mom to try and learn as much as she can from her so that then eventually she can kill her off and stay with dad all by herself. But again, as the baby starts to be a little bit older, she's getting closer to 5, she realizes that this is wrong. And so she represses her feelings. And as she's repressing her feelings, she internalizes her mother as her super ego. And so we call this the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. I think it's also important to point out that, especially during the 90s and early 2000s, there was a movement to sort of stop talking about Freud. And one of the reasons that people don't like talking about Freud is because Freud is kind of obsessed with sex. Everything is sex to Freud. And there is this sort of feeling that the psychosexual stages are sort of hypersexualizing children. And so, there's sort of this push against it. But it's harder to get rid of this theory without replacing it with something that makes more sense. In fact, I believe it's your book or one of the textbooks that we had in the past. One of the authors explained that she kind of had these negative feelings about Freud and how sexual he was and how he over sexualized children, but she had to admit that when her daughter was around 3 or 4, she said, "When I grow up, I'm going to marry daddy." And so the author, her mom, said, "Well, you can't marry daddy. I'm already married to daddy." And so the little girl says to her, "Well, by the time that I'm old enough to get married, you'll probably be dead anyway, and then I'll marry daddy." Right? And again, what you see here is almost exactly what Freud is talking about. It's not a negative feeling. It's not necessarily that the child is bad, but they're just weird emotions that seem to be turning on until the child can get a hold of them and then repress them. Now, I told you that it's kind of hard to replace this with something else. Now, some of the science has caught up, and in fact, we know that something similar to the phallic stage happens in birds. Um, a bird, when they are young, will imprint their mother into their brain. That's what we call it, imprinting. And when that baby bird is older, he will look for a partner that reminds him of his mom. And we can play with that. Well, what researchers do is they'll take a mom before the eggs hatch and they'll put magic marker on her face or on her body so that her markings are incredibly unique because the researcher put them there. And when that baby imprints his mom, he imprints her with those magic marker colors. When he's older and he's looking for a mate, the researchers will take a one of the random birds and add the magic marker to that female just like they had to the mom. And those baby birds, now that they're adult, tend to choose the female that reminds them of their mom. And so what we see here is something that's a little bit more scientific. There's more scientific data on it, but it's basically explaining this stage in Freud's psychosexual stages. Now, just like before, just like the other two stages, some people go through their Oedipus or electrocomplex without any kind of anxiety. Even though it sounds incredibly convoluted, people go through it without any anxiety. And so they move on. But if you develop anxiety in your phallic stage, then you might get fixated here. How do you develop anxiety here? Well, our culture goes completely out of this way to create anxiety here. We might tell little boys, you can't be hanging around your mom so much because she makes you into a sissy. Or little girls can't be out with their fathers all day long. Or maybe baby is holding on to mom and dad kind of pulls baby away and says, Mom is mine. And if you do that enough, that can create the kind of anxieties that will lead to a phallic stage fixation. So, what is a phallic stage fixation? These people are hypersexual. They tend to be obsessed with masturbation. They're incredibly flirtatious and they like to express virility. This is your lady friend who wears, the low cut V blouse with the push up bra. And this is your guy friend who's always showing his muscles and maybe his pants are a little too tight all the time. Now, I'm not talking about you're going to a party and you want to look sexy or nice. Um, Everybody does that. These are people who are obsessed with this. They can't go out to get the mail without sort of making themselves up. Um, these people are fixated in their phallic stage. Now, some people are fixated here, but they don't want to think of themselves as sexual or as creeps or as perverts. And so what they do is they repress their feelings and they show the exact opposite, a reaction formation. And so we get those restricted sexuality, people who don't like to even talk about sex. They see two people holding hands or kissing in public and they kind of lose it. They're like, oh, this is disgusting. Nobody knows how to act anymore. Um, this is your friend who like refuses to wear a shirt that's too tight, etc. And then, of course, some people repress their feelings, but they let them out in socially acceptable ways. And these people tend to be people who love art and poetry. They tend to fall in love with love. I like to call these people the Jennifer Lopez's of the world, right? They're kind of more in love with falling in love rather than sort of maintaining a relationship. And in fact, actors are often stuck in their phallic stage, right? Remember when the child had to act like they were buddying up to dad or they were buddying up to mom? That acting feeling sort of gets created here as well when they are adults. And these people tend to always strive for success. They're the kind of person who always has a goal. We all have goals, but people who are stuck in their phallic states, they never even get to enjoy achieving their goals. As soon as they achieve it, there's something else they have to do. There's something else they have to do because they're doing it kind of obsessively. Okay. Now, once people finish their phallic stage, they're going to enter latency. In latency, I kind of already described it. In latency, the child now is around 5 years old, and they realize that all of these feelings they've had don't really make sense. And so, what they do is they repress their feelings And as they're doing that, they internalize mom or dad as their super ego. Now, what it ends up happening because they repress all of these sexual feelings is that these little kids don't look sexual anymore. If you know a kid who's under 5 years old, sometimes they're creepy. They'll say and do things that are creepy. Um, they might be sort of running around the house naked all the time. They might oddly talk about sexual things like a boy they like or a girl they like, but not like, oh, they're cute, like in sexual ways. And you go, whew, this kid is going to be fire. This kid is weird. But then they hit latency and all of that seems to go away, just kind of all at once, because they've repressed all those feelings. And now this kid just isn't sexual at all. They don't really talk about sex. They don't really express sexual feelings anymore. And this continues until around puberty. And around puberty, they enter what we call the genital stage. And in the genital stage, their sexual feelings start to reawaken, but now to something that's a little bit more appropriate, to a romantic partner that they're looking for. Now, kids start to feel sexually oriented towards people. They want to find relationships. However, if they are fixated in one of those first three stages, then they're going to continuously regress back to that. They get upset and they regress back to their oral stage, or they get upset and they regress back to their anal stage, or they might regress back to their phallic stage. So, what does that look like? Again, sometimes it looks like what we already talked about, an oral fixation or a reaction formation or a sublimation. Um, but there's also sort of a sexual aspect to it. And so people who are fixated in their oral stage might be more obsessed with like oral sex. And people who are fixated in their anal stage might be obsessed with anal sex or just messy sex, like adding food to sex, things like that. And then, of course, people who are fixated in their phallic state seem to be obsessed with sex sort of in general. I have a good buddy, and I can't talk to him for more than 5 minutes before he starts talking about the girl he's, you know, dating or having sex with and what they've done together. And I'm like, I don't care, bro. I don't, please don't tell me more about this story. But that's just who he is. Sure enough, he's an actor as well. Um, and so these people sort of become obsessed with sex. All right, guys, those are Freud's psychosexual stages. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. And remember that there's a page in the packet specifically for the psychosexual stages.